because it's bigger. Like have it fixed.
Okay, it's okay.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Yeah, it's
We,
technology.
yeah.
Yeah.
If we had the files before, we could have tested.
I know. Yeah. Sorry. It's just one of those things.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's not bad.
It's better. It's definitely better than it was. Yep. Yeah. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Hello. Hello. That's better. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. First of all, thank you to our morning's panel. Brilliant. I now have the pleasure again of introducing the next panel, which is entitled Civic and the City. Together, we'll explore the relationship between civic values and our urban environment, looking at the spaces, infrastructure, and politics of our urban environments. Our panel is made up of 3 speakers, all based in London, although much of the work presented represents global concerns. Dr. Julia King is an architectural designer and an urban researcher at LSE Cities, where she has worked on super diverse streets, economies and spaces of urban migration in UK cities, and is currently working on the India Smart Cities project and the experience of density living in the new London Tower block with LSE London. Her research is concerned with housing, sanitation, infrastructure, urban planning, and participatory design processes. Her talk today is titled Infrastructure as a Civic Property and Not a Thing. Next is Owen Hodgkinson from the arts group Assembly SE8, who are collaborators with Public Works on a number of projects taking place in Deptford. His talk entitled Lessons from the Community Garden, Conflicts, Complexities, and Cooperation. Assembly SE8 are a collective based in Deptford who work intimately with local communities and place. Assembly's practice borders art, activism, design, and landscape, and seeks to examine the dynamics of placemaking. But first, I'd like to invite Adam Kaza to speak on designing politics, decolonizing an urban ideas challenge. Adam is the interdisciplinary scholar who specializes in the politics of the city, foregrounding the role of architecture and design. He is the director of Teatro Mundi, a professional network of urbanists and artists, and offers a forum for cross-disciplinary discussion about practices relating to cultural and public space in the city, and is based at the London School of Economics. So I'd now like to invite Adam to join us for his presentation.
Like that? Okay,
And
great.
then,
That's a click?
Yep.
Okay, great. Great, well, hello, good afternoon. Thanks for having me here, and thanks for the invite. I was particularly enthused by this morning's 3 speakers, and I think there's a lot of crossover with what I might say in some of the work that we've been doing. So I'm hoping we can start to maybe make some connections across these talks and build up a kind of conversation of value and a politics. So I'm Adam. And I run a program called Teatro Mundi, which hosts kind of interdisciplinary conversations, salons. They're intentionally small, and they're intentionally closed to, let's say, a larger public. And I'm just letting you know this because it's part of the ethics of it. In a sense, we're trying to create forums that aren't about spectacle, because as much as public debate and public forums are about expanding conversations beyond your local kind of sets of actors, they can also force people to perform to their publics, to be pitching to their publics, and because everyone has things at stake. So when you actually create forums that are closed, that ame aren't recorded, there's a bit more vulnerability that can be opened up, and so that's kind of central to the project itself. Today I'm just going to give you an anecdote of something that we've been trying to think through, because we, over the last 3 years, have hosted, as part of the works that we do, an annual ideas challenge, which in its core is basically akin to an architectural competition. So there's a brief that's sent out, people can send in their proposals, there's a jury that chooses a selection of winners, and an exhibition. The kind of format of the ideas challenge is very much familiar, perhaps to those of you who have entered or have seen these things before. But it took place in 3 very different cities, and I'll get to that in a second. And in the last city that we were in Rio de Janeiro, with the people that we were working with and the institutions we partnered with, there were a set of kind of mirrored confrontations with not just the kind of content or who we wanted to partner with, but actually with the very kind of technique of this thing called this ideas challenge, or the kind of the format of a competition as a productive or even possible way of interacting with the larger public. So there was some kind of feedback and senses of concern about access, about expertise, that we hadn't thought before in the previous 2 iterations, which happened to be in cities of New York and London. And so there's a very kind of interesting set of thinking that we're having to think about now, not just what we're learning from this last competition, which I'll introduce in a second because it's hard to explain up front, but also why we were only confronted by those questions in Rio de Janeiro and not in New York and London, which have equal barriers to access and questions around expertise. So kind of just, I called it decolonizing an urban ideas challenge, and that's a very large statement, but it sits within, I think, a process of trying to think not just about content, but actual structures of institutions, structures of ways of doing things, and trying to decolonize or think critically about how those are set up and how the very insides of a mechanism, as seemingly open as an open brief and an open call and an open urban competition, actually within it contains things that provide barriers of access. It may seem very clear to some of you who might have thought, well, how come you didn't think of that before? But for us internally, embedded inside also the structures, inside our own heads and our own ways of working, the kind of the colonization of knowledge and the persistence of that is something that one needs to be thinking of, and we were confronted with and are now thinking of it. So just kind of 2 quotes that I pulled out from an author, Walter Mignolo's piece called on delinking, which is a great kind of piece and central to kind of decolonizing and decolonial thinking, is the sentence "learning to unlearn," which they took from the Universidad Intercultural de los Pueblos Indígenas del Ecuador, and then also from Aníbal Quijano, who's very much a kind of progenitor, but writes primarily in Spanish, who's thinking about this notion of, and I love this phrase, the provincial pretense to universality. So the kind of pretense that things are the same, the pretense of translation or comparison, the pretense of mobility, and our now needing to think that through based on what happened in Rio de Janeiro, which I'm setting up as this big thing. It's not that big, but you'll see in a second what I mean, and I hope it gives us something to think about. And then also just to kind of spell out and give a sense of maybe what and how we're thinking of this, is trying to think through, I mean, even from this morning's 3 talks, thinking very much about large ideological structures like capital or land, expertise, labor, the university itself, the art institution itself, etc. that these ideologies don't just exist in content. So it's not just an argument about content or dissenting opinions, but actually the very division of knowledges that are materialized in things like universities, in things like disciplines, in things like the museum, and perhaps in things like the actual mechanics of an urban competition. So just very briefly, this is some of the stuff we do. I'll race through these images, but we do meet, we do host things, we do have conversations. We sometimes do them in London, we sometimes do them outside the city. This was one that we partnered with the Onassis Cultural Center in Athens. And I speak about it just also because we were thinking, actually I won't speak about it, I'm gonna race through because I wanna get to the more interesting stuff. Designing politics has three basic tensions that we think about, and this is perhaps important to think through. One is the tension between form and the social, which I think is an underlying tension and thinking process for anyone who's thinking the city, for anyone who's thinking relationships of like architectural and the social, who's working between design and the social sciences, or thinking politically about making. So what is the relationship between these two things? How do they interact? Where are their convergences? The second is around a tension between expertise and democracy. And here really trying to think carefully and critically about these two terms, about how they're playing out now within larger fields of politics. And I think just, yeah, thinking carefully what we mean by it, that the denial of expertise isn't necessarily democratic, and that democracy might work within pluralist systems of knowledges that we could call expertise at certain points, but not necessarily. So trying to think within that sense. One example would be, is a democratic ethos best placed at the moment of design, as in a participatory design process of a public space? Or is it better to fight for a democratic ethos in the actual ownership of that space, or its use? Where do we think democracy, or what we think of democracy, should be placed and displaced? So just kind of opening up these conversations. And the last is around scale and complexity. And you'll see in a moment the kind of examples I'll give why this question becomes important. Primarily, it's because a lot of people think that the work or the ideas that come out of this kind of ideas challenge, which are very small, they're very local, they're very propositional, they may not be possible to be built, are ineffective, are naive, are politically useless because they're not scalable, and they're not scalable to confront structural questions of megadevelopment or the crisis of housing or capital. And we want to try to think and confront that. And so this slipping scale we're trying to introduce between scale and complexity, that there's something really important about small, or in the words of one of the presenters this morning, local. But thinking that alongside how granular and complex you can really be thinking things through. And is there a kind of descending relationship as you scale up? Do your ideas necessarily become less complex because you can't deal with the complexity on the ground? So these are the three questions we're kind of thinking through this ideas challenge. And I mentioned we've done it for 3 years. The first was in New York, called Designing for Free Speech. The second was in London in 2015, called Designing the Urban Commons. And the third was in Rio de Janeiro, called Designing Respect. The idea for the competition came out of a workshop in New York in 2013, following the Occupy movement by a professor named Stephen Duncombe, who'd been part of the movement and was trying to think through social movement, public space, etc. And the idea was, if we know that design is political, what would happen if you set a brief to be intentionally political? What if you said you had to, if we know that people can design against free speech, if we know that we can design against assembly, if we know that you can design against certain kinds of bodies, what would happen if you intentionally asked someone to design for something like free speech, which is the First Amendment in the US Constitution. So it's a very kind of performative, politically active part of that system of politics. And what would that conversation open up? We got a lot of people saying maybe you can't design for politics, maybe you shouldn't design for politics, and a lot of others suggesting there might be ways in. So it's an intentionally kind of provocative question. In London, it was around the Commons because of the history of that notion in this country, and in Rio, after quite a heated debate, it was decided that the ideal or the kind of political gesture would be around respect. And it moved very far from kind of respect as tolerance for difference to thinking about infrastructure as respect, movement in the city as respect, protection from police brutality as respect. So just very quickly, I'll give you a few examples from the first two, and then I'll speak about some of the challenges we faced in Rio and were confronted to think carefully about. So this was the New York competition, and just two quick examples of some of the things that we got back. This was from an entry called the Floating Agora, and they suggested that actually free speech in New York is impossible, that you can't have it in that city anymore. And so if we want to think about having free speech in an American context, it needs to be in exile, and it needs to be therefore a kind of floating space in the Hudson River, and they kind of presented this very kind of classical gesture to antiquity of a kind of performative space for politics. And another, which again is kind of a literal take on the question, was called the Pop-Up Sound Garden. And it's a kind of fabric tensile structure that folds up into a knapsack, but can be kind of planted like a seed and deployed, so then you can kind of speak and gesture to your public. In London, the Commons actually gave us a range of things, but a lot of them weren't very architectural or urban in their form. They were a little different. One was called Service Wash, and the gesture in this was actually finding a kind of a moment in planning law that protects laundrettes in the UK from ever-changing use. So they're a kind of class A1 retail space. So they can be bought and sold, but they can't be turned into cafes or restaurants and the like. And the gesture they suggested was that that's actually now, that could be read as a commons. It's a kind of forever space, can't be changed. And so they suggested it be turned into a distributed network of resources for people who are homeless or are near homelessness, or who require access to services like a shower, laundry machines, etc. And the other was called the Commons Economy Generator. And so just to give you a sense of kind of the differences of things that we got, this was really kind of an organogram example of how resources between various kind of groups who are commoning in the city could be shared. So it was kind of like a commons resource for people who are commoning. And very much around sharing resources, sharing labor, sharing expertise. When it came to Rio, I'm going to tell you about three moments that we faced. The first was on my first visit, and we assembled through really wonderful partners, a kind of a team who were going to help even think through what would this look like? Is it interesting for Rio? What kind of question might we ask? What's relevant right now in 2016? And the first question they asked, not even to me but to each other, was, do we really need this person? It sounds like a pretty simple thing to do. Can we just do it on our own? Do we need to partner with the London School of Economics? He can't even understand us right now because we're speaking very fast in Portuguese. Why is he here? Do we want this? So that didn't happen in New York and London. People weren't asking if we even wanted to have this thing happen. And so as a first question, that was kind of interesting. And they asked me back, well, why do you want to do this in Rio? And again, that wasn't really a question that we were asked in New York or London. It was just seen as a natural good that if you're at a university, you do things with public people, and then they send you things back, and you have a discussion, and it's a good. So we were both kind of struck, both myself and the team that I had, and the people we were working with, both had to work to articulate why we thought this was important. That was the first kind of the step. The second was when they looked really close about the way in which we set up the competitions. They said, well, first of all, if you partner with universities in Rio, then it'll be great. You'll have access to their institutional resources, you'll have access to their students, but it will be a white, upper-class competition. And it'll be very predictable, it'll be very solid results, but just so you know, if you partner with a university, that's what you're gonna get. So you can choose, if you want, to maybe partner with another organization. And they had a great suggestion, which is called Spectaculu, which is the organization we partnered with. And they run an art and technology school for young adults from peripheral neighborhoods, and have been active for over 17 years. So we partnered with them, and all of a sudden the tone and the shift was very different. And we had a lot of backlash from universities that the London School of Economics usually partners with. Then they looked at what we were asking people to submit. And they said, oh, it's really interesting. Like, you're in New York and London, you've got these like amazing, like incredibly designed AO posters. Like, wow, like that's so cool. And they said, it's really interesting because that assumes that someone has a computer. It assumes they have a design language. It assumes they have time and resources to create this kind of AO board. So all of a sudden, you're excluding a lot of people who may never have come across design software or don't know how to organize information in a huge AO board. So they said, wouldn't it be more interesting if you could just make a competition that anyone who had a phone or access to a phone, which a lot of people do in Brazil, could participate. So why don't you just make it like you have to submit 5 photographs, and that's it. So we thought, okay, that's interesting. Might get very different results, but it'll kind of open it up. So that was the next gesture. Again, in New York and London, no one raised an eyebrow that we were asking for designed AO boards. And surprise, surprise, mostly we got entries from architectural students. And in Rio, almost none. The third thing in Rio was in 2016 in Brazil, there was a government military coup, and there were a lot of protests, and there was a lot of question about democracy and institutions. And so there was a hesitation by our jury of acting like a jury and taking in these results from a large number of people, a lot of them from peripheral neighborhoods and spaces of low income, and deciding a winner in a black box and then presenting that in an exhibition. So the jury themselves decided to devolve the jury to create a peer jury, so that everyone who submitted would become a peer jury of each other, and each team would submit their top 10 votes, and through that process we would find the winners. Again, in London and New York, the idea of an expert jury was never raised as a question or a challenge. So those were the kind of 3 moments in Rio that basically kind of undercut. Basically, the first question was, why are you doing this? The second, in the processes and mechanics of the actual setup, you're excluding a lot of people. And the third, the a priori thinking that an expert jury is a good thing in and of itself is also something up for debate. We're kind of cut across the essentials of any kind of urban competition or architectural competition. And it turned out, to be, to be one of our best competitions ever. We had the most responses, we had the most diverse set of participants, we had the highest press coverage, and the exhibition was attended by over 3,000 people. So it was a really, really strong competition, even though there was hesitation because of all these changes. There's just one example of one who were thinking about the right to imagine yourself as part of a city, and in a place like Rio, and maybe other places too, that's not an equal right that's distributed. And finally, one about kind of dramatic gentrification in Pequena, Africa, which is right around the port of Rio. And they're speaking about the big displacement through some major infrastructural and institutional projects with the Olympics. So I'm just going to end with a final kind of reflection. When we came back to London, thinking that something had really changed in Rio and something had really happened in this competition and we'd learned something about how to do this, we actually ended up facing a huge amount of backlash from our own team and our own colleagues who saw these results, who looked at these undesigned photographs and looked at the text that was submitted that might have been a little less erudite than some of the submissions from London or New York, and called the competition naive, called it a bit of a waste of time, questioned us being in Rio and if it was really worth our time, without really engaging with the ideas. But there's a kind of superficial protection of the geographies of knowledge and the institutions of knowledge. We didn't have any major university partners. And so it's just, we're now kind of reflecting on both a process of being confronted with and learning from the kind of obstacles to participation in the very setup of a competition, and really trying to think critically now as we're back here, why so many people don't like what happened in Rio. Is it really because the ideas are bereft, or is there some other kind of structural thing happening here, where a design board is much better than a kind of photograph etc. So we're trying to think through these things now, and yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
So we have to try and click that on. And then
That's what we're doing.
really good.
And I'm done. All right, thanks. Thanks everyone for coming. You can hear me, yeah. Yeah, my name is Julie King. I also work at LSE. I was not one of those colleagues. Thanks, Adam. And I just thought I should make that clear. And I'm going to talk about work that began whilst I was at London Met with Maurice Mitchell and Peter Carl. And then I migrated to LSE, where it was supported by LSE. And then now I'm supported by the Royal Commission of 1851 doing this work. And so this presentation is about unplanned in a master planning sense, a sort of process of coming together around the production and maintenance of small-scale infrastructural configurations that reveal infrastructure as a civic property and not a thing, in the subsequent improvements of the built fabric, both at the level of individual households and in the neighborhood more generally, and how the material and aesthetic improvements animate a process that I describe as consolidation, the making of permanence, physically, politically, socially, and institutionally. The story begins in 2003, when India won the bid to hold the 2010 Commonwealth Games, triggering over the next 3 years the relocation of around 1 million people, yeah, a very disputed figure, but a lot of people, living in various slum clusters in the city, driven out to peripheral settlements like this one. I've just noticed this isn't the PowerPoint I sent this morning. Can I? Sorry. Can I?
Yeah.
I'm going to keep on talking. Sorry. I'm going to carry on talking. And can you load something in there? Sorry. I work at night and send things in the morning. So the story begins in 2003 when India won the bid to hold the Commonwealth Games, triggering over the next 3 years the relocation of around I've already said that, right. The original planning of Savdagevra by the Municipal Corporation of Delhi.
Just trying to copy it onto my desktop.
Just open it directly.
Yeah?
Yeah. Sorry, and I'm losing minutes. I'm going to speak fast now. So, the original planning of Savdagevra by the Municipal Corporation of Delhi included just 9 community toilet complexes, which if we assume at the time of construction that all the latrines are working, which they weren't, as you can clearly see in this image, there would be 1 latrine for every 250 women. The end result is that 88% of the population in Savdagevra defecated in the open. A common contemporary paradox, as Delhi is surely not devoid of a municipal budget in light of the Commonwealth Games, which supposedly cost $4.1 billion US. From this well-known tragedy of sanitation services in the Indian context, I began what feels like a sort of a love affair and an ongoing project that explores the possibility of developing infrastructure, here sanitation only, using techniques and procedures of the incremental housing economy. In particular, asking, would it be possible to use incrementalism to develop a collective, shared commitment to a very common problem? The project was an interplay between 3 phenomena: the design, planning, and installation of a sanitation system with its particular attributes and requirements, both technical and economic, a consultation process which moved from an aggregate of individual wants to a collaborative design-based action, to a political institution with representation, and finally the movement in and out of consultation to political process, which involved myself, the partnering NGO CURE, engineers, local government, and contractors. And so for me, this thing really began in 2011 when I was doing my PhD fieldwork, and I identified a key transition happened as houses grew vertically. These 2 photographs show the same plot a year apart. This investment is triggered by a daughter coming of age or a bride entering into the family home, and is centered around the inclusion of a toilet. You can see would have washed in that sort of front bit, and then there's a toilet at the top. I started then running through a series of very naive questions, starting with, that's great, it's all about toilets, but we're in the middle of nowhere, where does the shit go? And the answer is, it goes into a pit underneath a home called a septic tank. So I found a book on septic tanks and found this diagram, learning that septic tanks do not work in isolation and need an outlet into some kind of treatment or sewage system. The result is what you can see in this image. The outlet discharges into open grey water drains. And it was in this context and working with the local NGO that I started to develop a project to bring sanitation to this poor and peripheral and disconnected settlement. We discussed a lot. I drew on whiteout boards. I made shitty models. I had lots and lots of meetings like this. And the final project had 4 components: an in-house toilet, 2 communal drains, 3, a common septic tank, and 4, an upflow reed bed filter. I had to show how the pilot project would work for the whole site to the government, and construction began 3 years after conception in 2014. This was the only lane wide enough for the digger to make it through, to dig this rather massive hole into which the tanks were put, the streets, we laid sewer pipes, and manholes were built by men who lived on this very street. And this is the image during construction, and this is it last year. This is the operation and maintenance team, mostly comprised of women. And lastly, at the back of the shared management of this project, a residents' welfare association emerged, a legitimate political body, and of course, the president is a man. I have purposefully not dwelled on the ins and outs of how this project happened. I recognize projects like this have been happening for decades, and I've spoken and written about it. So I would like to use this opportunity today to talk about this small infrastructural project in terms of 4 key ideas or themes that attend to the question of this symposium. How can we enable civil societies to act towards social collective change? And it's this thing that I'm thinking of infrastructure as politics, as de facto legality, driving development, and finally, engagement and participation. Infrastructure as politics. The relationship between sanitation practices, incremental infrastructure, and the state. The sanitation project raised the issue of the lack of adequate sanitation and began a relative, significant program of capital investment in a decentralized sewage treatment system. In parallel to these infrastructural improvements, the process created a neighborhood dialogue in which residents in the politics of shit can go from being victimized populations to those that can claim and become politically engaged in urban life. This was most apparent in the all-women operation and maintenance team, who are responsible for the long-term management of the project and are the first port of call for residents wishing to connect into the system, but also the establishment of the RWA. I think both these are examples of what Arjuna Padarai means as deep democracy, efforts among the urban poor to mobilize and mediate between the extremes of the world-class city. The RWA was the first of its kind in a slum resettlement colony in Delhi. RWAs are typically associated with upper and middle-class private property owners, the impact of which Asher Gertner at the LSE has done extensive work on, describing how inner-city, upper-class RWAs were one of the many drivers for the push to eradicate slums and the eventual creation of places like Savdagevra in the first place. RWAs are institutionalized spaces that facilitate and mediate relations between neighborhood residents and government municipal authorities. In order to participate in the city, the residents of Savdagevra managed to create enough consensus and agency, at first via the NGO Cure, and afterwards through institutions like the RWA, indeed a process that is still ongoing today. This, for me, was also a methodological point for the designer. This diagram reflects how at the beginning, I, in the light blue line, was perhaps the most involved actor, driving the project forward. But over the time, the NGO and then the community took over. The sweet spot is where the residents are fully engaged in the process and institutionalized politics of civic, order, or town have taken over. What emerges in this diagram